have the possibility to accommodate, to somehow live with this changing environment in small adaptation measures that people can do for themselves. This is basically the part Konstantin will talk about later, how people can adapt without migrate to other places and places where there's not many options for technical protection. But these are basically the options. You see, migration is only one of them, and maybe only a half of these three options. So people have other options than to migrate. Next slide, please. And this just two examples from Bangladesh. One of our case studies, floating gardens, for example, are a traditional way in coastal Bangladesh, in southern Bangladesh, to adapt to rising flood levels, rising and falling flood levels. So this means they have their fields not on solid ground, but they can swim up. If there's a flood, they just the whole field swim up. A very traditional way practiced in hundreds of years to adapt to an ever-changing environment. This is an example for accommodation. The next example, next slide, please. A bit more modern sector, if you want. This is brick production, which is very necessary. For example, around Dhaka, this is the capital city of Bangladesh, approximately the same size than Jakarta, 15, 18, 20 million population, wherever you want to measure it. And this growing city in a delta area needs building materials. Building materials are basically bricks, because you don't have solid rock there, delta area. And also these factories producing bricks are kind of seasonal factories. They produce in the dry season, and everything is removed in the wet season. And so you have kind of a perfect seasons with more flooding or less flooding. So you see, not only modern technology that provides us with this possibilities of adapting to environmental change where we are, but also very traditional. Next slide. Yeah, but a question, do climate refugees exist? I don't know if you ever heard about it. Toyota, he's from Kiribati, Pacific Island. Very flat Pacific Island, you can see the picture on the left. Very shallow water around these islands and very flat islands that could be flooded in the next 2 or 3 centuries. So it's really a problem people in Kiribati live in. There are not too many people living in Kiribati. The state is only a little bit less than 100,000 population, much more than Indonesia. But you see these islands could be affected by sea level rise, one of the most severe cases maybe. Ione Toyota, he filed a case in New Zealand. He wanted to be accepted as an asylum seeker in New Zealand. And the New Zealand court, the Supreme Court, went through all the judicial instances in New Zealand. This case filed of asylum right for him to live in New Zealand and not having to return to Kiribati. And the Supreme Court of New Zealand, next slide, please, had to decide, is this a reason why die in another country? And they say, no, this is not a reason for an asylum seeker. And what it basically means that in international law, something like a climate refuge doesn't exist because we don't have one case in the world. We don't have one case in the world which is asylum seeker. What the judge said was very interesting. It was basically 2 reasons why his case was declined. First reason is given here in this quote. There is no evidence that the government is not willing to do everything to protect its citizens. It's not about the real state facing. It's about the state or the government trying to protect. This is the basis for asylum, national law. And of course, there was no proof that the state of Kiribati doesn't want to protect Ione Toyota's life, the life of his wife and his children. So this is the reason why we don't have the national law. Something like this doesn't exist. When we ever talk about climate refugees, we're talking about something which is not backed by international law. I'm not from law studies. I'm a geographer, so I don't want to go into detail with that. But this is the perspective of international law. And the second reason for declining his case was also interesting. The judge, the highest judge in New Zealand, said, academic studies, scientific studies are not able to deliver us proof about climate change that we need for, uh, according to international law. Up to you. Was young scientists and older scientists make our for case. Now you can say, okay, this is the Geneva Refugee Convention of 1951. This is not 2022. Sure, you could also change the Geneva Convention, Asylum Convention, Refugee Convention, but still today we can't really talk about climate refuge. And this has consequences for science and academic studies as well. Next slide. And if you see the debate in academia on something like climate, environment, refugees, you can also see that the wording, the terminology changed over time. Starting in the mid-1990s, then the first studies came out reporting about climate migrants, refugees. Their terms like environmental refugees was a very standard term in first study. And then it changed slightly, and you see the refugee term got lost over the time, and also the main reason for migrating changed over time. Went from environmental or climate change refugees to environmentally induced migration. Refugee term is gone. Almost not used anymore for good reason. So you see, environmentally induced means it's a migration process, and migration always means there's some kind of freedom of choice. Whereas a refugee they're always forced to do something. A migrant wants to do. So there's freedom of choice in some in many of these decisions. This element of freedom of choice. Then you see climate change induced displacement, and then you see migration influenced by environmental change. This is obviously something very, very different. Not only a change in terminology, but a change in thinking. The Foresight report in 2011 is important because this was the first report that tried to consolidate all our knowledge on climate change and migration in 2011. Already oldest report, but this is a very important, say, kind of keystone in this whole discussion. And you see, migration influenced by environmental change is something very different. This means there's freedom of choice in a lot of situations, some situations at least, and environmental change, climate change is only one factor for migration, and there might be other factors that might be more important. And this is basically also our thinking, but it's not so. Us, that's academic thinking of today. Next slide. What we have is kind of discussion of, I say, alarmists. Sometimes, usually people from environmental studies, they tend to support for migration. Where they live. Whereas migrations experts tend to say, yes, the environment is changing. It might be one factor contributing to a migration, but it's only one factor among many factors that could actually influence this migration. And this is basically the debate we have today. You could say migration experts, natural science. But I think the migration experts have a lot of arguments on their side, and I don't see too many good arguments on the side of the environmental research. Not that environmental researchers doing bad research, not at all. But the shortcut explanation, environmental change, leads to something people do. That might be the problem there. I think that's the field of more social scientists, and I should talk to social scientists maybe about this question. It doesn't say that physical or science research doesn't make sense. Just the shortcut to migration. Next slide, please. Level rise is a phenomenon we can measure. That's not kind of a thing that the models produce. We measure that the sea level is rising. And we know in global average is about 3.5 millimeters a year. Very exact knowledge through altimetry measurements, remote sensing techniques, through a lot of data that we have. So we are almost 100% sure that we can 3.5 millimeters a year. That doesn't sound much, but if you measure 3.5 millimeters over 100 years, over 200 years, obviously an impact. What you see on this map is, and that's the problem, this is the global average that we know exactly. But you look at this map, it's going to red, it's above these 3.5 millimeters in global average, and it's going to below the global average. And you see different regions in the world are differently affected by sea level rise. And unfortunately, you see in Indonesia, you have red colors, so sea level rise here is a little bit stronger than in the global average. Whereas you see the coast, partly of the coast of Europe, for example, they're much less affected. So different areas are differently affected by these global trends of sea level rise. But it is existing, not something we have only in models, and we measure it every day. No doubt about it. Next slide. And then you have, of course, regions in the world, it's probably not too good to see from your position. These red areas are large delta areas around the globe. You see you have affected coast in Asia. You see this big red dot next to India, that's the Bangladesh Delta, deep red, highly vulnerable to sea level rise. But you can also see the east coast of the US are also one of the areas most affected by future sea level rise. The US is one of the most affected countries in the years to come. We know. Next slide. There was a study in 2007 about the impact that sea level rise and other phenomena that come with sea level rise, like cyclones, but affect population in large ports relatively close to the coast. And this study at that time was commissioned by the OECD, a large study, and they compared 136 cities around the globe, close to the coast, and predicted how much more population will be affected in future by sea level rise, tropical cyclones. Study. And you see these red and blue boxes. These are exactly the cities in the areas we talk about today. So the most affected city will be Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. Second most affected city will be Chittagong, second largest city in Bangladesh. Then you see on position 6, it's Khulna, the third largest city in Bangladesh. Then you see it's Kolkata, that's eastern India, not far from the Bangladeshi coast. Then you see Lomé, Africa, that's the capital of Togo in West Africa. You see Abidjan, that's the capital of Ivory Coast, West Africa. And then you also see Jakarta, capital of Indonesia. Among these most affected cities in the world. And if you look at Dhaka, this data, that means that the population of Dhaka city will be 12 times higher in 2070 than it was in 2005. A massive growth of vulnerable people, a massive growth of people that are directly affected by these changes. And then you think twice. Is it really only climate? Only the change in physical system? Now the second thought tells you, no, probably not. Maybe urbanization is a much more important factor for this increase in affected population. So we always have two sides. Of course, the climate system changes, the sea level rises, and the risk of suffering under coastal flooding and cyclones will increase in future till 2070 in this model calculation. But also the growth of city will go on very, very quickly. And this 12 times more population affected is partly explained by the changing climate system, but partly and maybe more just moving that are located close to coastal areas, because a coastal location has many advantages. For trade in the world economy, it's very good to be a coast, port there. It's much easier to do it than to do it from the hinterland. And that's why then Pasar is located at the coast, and that's why Kolkata is located at the coast historically. This will still be important for world economy, which relies on trade. So it makes sense for these people to move in high-risk areas. But what we can observe today, statistically, in many, many countries in the world, people move to higher-risk areas, from lower-risk areas to higher-risk areas. And they do this on a systematic basis. So there are always two sides of this coin. One is, say, the social change in the social and economic system. The other is the change in the physical system. You can't explain it only by one factor if you're looking at only one factor. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the world journey we want to do. These red circles, on the left the west, that's West African coast. I will go with you to West African coast. Then we will go to the Ganges Brahmaputra Delta, and we will go to Indonesia a little bit later. And I want to start with West Africa, looking at the West African coast. This is Ghana. Ghana in the middle of this long stretch of West Africa. And it has a colonial history. So Ghana was the first country in Africa that gained independence in the late 1950s. Therefore, in development studies, a very important country because gaining independence. But that's not our major point. A little bit history is necessary at this point because old data, context of history. Ghana was in the western part, west of Lake Volta, this massive dam for energy production that's built in the early 1960s, was a former British colony. The east of that, going to Togo, was a former German colony. Up to the First World War, it was German. So Ghana is colony. But of course, Germany lost its colonies after the First World War through the Treaty of Versailles that actually changed the map of the world at that time. Then the German colony Togoland went to the French, so it later was a French colony, which is now actually the basis of the state Togo in Africa. And the eastern part of Togoland went to Ghana, to the new independent state of Ghana. Not that important, but a little bit necessary to otherwise we understand this old data. We can't understand this old data. And you see they have a coastline stretching from the coast to Ivory Coast in the west to the border of Togo in the east. Next slide, please. And we look at Haiti. That means it's exactly this area around the border between today's Ghana and today's Togo. Next slide. Okay. Thank you very much. So this is a kind of a closer look at this Keita area. Don't want to go too much detail there, but you see right from the map, this is a kind of a difficult situation. The city of Keita is actually located in. It's between a lagoon in the hinterland and the open coast to the North Atlantic, to the southeast. So a very narrow stretch of land. So this already, if you look okay with, this is a difficult location if you face climate change and you face sea level. But you see these red lines here, these are sea defense walls. So the government of Ghana with some international donors, they built a sea defense wall to protect this stretch of the Ghanaian coast from coastal erosion because it's massive. So we also have to take into account, or in our explanation, the impact of the sea defense walls. I will show you a picture later how they look. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is what coastal erosion really means. Keita is a small town today, about 50,000 inhabitants, so much smaller than Bazaar, but still a historically important town along the West African coast. And because the West African coast was very strategically very important for European colonial powers from the 17th century till the mid-20th century, almost all European countries built forts, military forts along the coast of West Africa to first control the gold trade because it's a gold-rich area, and every European country tried to protect some claims along this South African coast. Some of you might know the former name of Ghana was Gold Coast. Yes, we have a lot of resources there. And later, and very sadly, these were transformed to prisoners for the slave trade. So this also has also bad history in slave trade. Anyway, this Port Prinsenstein, you can see here, was built by the Danish. The Danish were never part of the slave trade, but the Danish were very interested at the time before about gold from West African hinterland. And you see this Port Prinsenstein looked like the upper right in 1970, was still standing, and today it's only cut into half. And not only Port Prinsenstein is cut into half, half of the historical city of Keita is gone somewhere in the ocean. So we lost half of the city extent of this historic city. And Fort Prinzenstein was built right in the middle and it was cut through in the middle, and you only see one half still existing. The others is in the ocean. And if you talk to people that live there and you ask them, where was the house of your parents when you were born? They point to the ocean and said, okay, 600 meters there in the Atlantic Ocean, there was our family home. So you see, people actually live as a dramatic change. This not only happens in the last couple of years, it started to happen since the early 1980s, that we lose part of the West African coast. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is when you wander around in Keita, this is what you see. Old historical buildings, completely vacant or gone to the ocean 600 meters away from the today's coast. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is, for example, a man I talked with who was 4 years ago. He was still living in the hinder part of his house, and the front of his house was already washed away by the sea. So this is how people try to stay there when they want to live along the West African coast. Next slide, please. Yeah, and very lucky, the Germans that have had their colony up to the First World War, up to the first 20th century, right east to Keita, were very interested in Keita as a trading post, which was English at that time. But they sent their cartographers to draw excellent maps of the Ghanaian coast for commercial interests, basically. And the good thing today is that we have these historic maps, very good maps on the conditions of the West African coast in 1910, 112 years ago. Excellent maps they drew. Not for a good reason, but still we have these maps today. And you see, this is the map that they draw in 1910, and I have to show you this on the map. You see, this was the coastline at that time when the German cartographers in 1910 produced these maps, and this was the beach line already in 1999. Half of the sea is gone. Imagine half of Denpasar somewhere out there in the ocean, what it would mean for people and what it means for these people in West Africa. Really, really dramatic, no doubt. Next slide. The state tries to have a relocation program. So the state in the hinterland builds houses and try to relocate the affected families to the hinterland. But you can imagine if half of your city is lost, the state actually can't keep up with these many people that lose their houses. Almost impossible to do that. Next slide. This is the sea defense wall. In principle, a good idea. You see, this is our massive rocks that are thrown along the coast, and they actually protect parts of the old city of Keita since 5 to 6 years when this sea defense wall was built. The problem of this defense wall is that areas next to Keita are now affected. So it only shifts the problem to other locations, basically villages around Keita. Next slide. When you look at villages around Keita, it now looks like this. This was the former primary school of Keita, which was a stone building, and something is still left. All the other buildings, which were built from bamboo, from mud, they're all gone already. So dying village after dying village, because the sea defense wall only shifts the problem to other areas. Massive problem for people that live there. So what does it say about Ghana? What would you learn about Ghana when we look at adaptation migration? The interesting thing is that people in Ghana react by leaving the area. So Keita, in many ways, is a dying town. So people avoid to live there, go to other areas in Ghana, go to neighboring countries in West Africa, Togo, Benin, Ivory Coast, Nigeria. They just move to other places. Some of them even move to Europe. So people facing this massive environmental change tend to migrate away. They don't try that much to adopt where they are, but they migrate. So migration is a dominating reaction of these people. There are now some return migrants even from Europe to this area, and they try to build up a tourism business. You could say hotels, restaurants, because it's beautiful coast otherwise. So try to build up some tourism there, but with mixed results. The reason why these people migrate, of course, environmental change, where they live. But there are other factors as well. Migration is socially very accepted in West African populations. So migration is more the rule than the exception. So people are used to migrate. And so migration seems to be a very logical, very natural way of adapting to these changes. And then also Keita lost its political um, importance as a provincial capital because the state of moved the provincial capital from Keita to an inland location, which actually makes Keita less interesting for business, less interesting for Ghana and politics because the political center moved away. That means Keita is not the place to be. There's not much to expect there. There are not many options and chances for you. And you have this environmental change. And you have a population that culturally actually embraces migration. And so we have the reaction of migrating instead of adapting where they are. And now Konstantin will show a very different case study, which might sound much more familiar to you because it's in Indonesia.
Yes, Boris, thank you very much. Also, warm welcome from my side. My name is Konstantin, and I'm a PhD student from Boris Working Group. Currently doing my PhD in a project dealing with coastal hazards in Indonesia and adaptation processes of local communities in the coastal areas there. So I'm going to present to you some of the work that has been done in the last few years. So my colleague Lisa Niesters used to run a project that was dealing with the northern coast of Java. So we were focusing on the coastal part of Jakarta and the Semarang Bay with the Makan Kendal. So this is a map you're fairly familiar with. Could you go please to the next slide? So picking up something that we talked about earlier, sea level rise is a general problem for coastal communities worldwide, will also obviously affect Indonesia. I mean, who has more coast than guys? It's going to be affecting the whole country apparently. And but what we can still see when we look at the trend from 1993 till 2015 so far, that there's also very big regional differences in the height of the sea level rise that we see on average. So in some parts, especially if you look at the northern coast of Java, you see it's actually not that red as you may expect, as you may hear from news of flooding from these areas. We will go a bit more into detail into that. So the global mean is about 3.4 millimeters per year, but in Indonesia you have like some places where it's a bit sinking, sometimes where it's rising a bit faster. Next slide, please. Yes, so but this talk, I'm just going to focus more on Semarang because we did more specialized work on that area. So this is the modeling of sea level rise until 2100, which would project the sea level rise of 77.5 centimeters. And what you can see here is the whole Semarang urban area with some stretches of the Makan Kendal to the sides. And especially, as you can see, the Old Town area and the port area are highly affected areas today by coastal tidal flooding, and also as a forecast, highly affected by sea level rise. And that sea level rise is projected to, without any mitigation measures put in place today, would travel upwards to 4.5 kilometers inland. Next slide, please. So what we did, we worked together with some colleagues from Potsdam University in Germany, and they installed in different areas in Semarang tide gauge stations. So they measured the sea level over the span of years, seasons, and they take the annual average. And what you can see here, so you have the blue part of the graph actually shows you the development from 2012 until 2017. So over the course of 5 years of the mean sea level in this of those areas where it was measured. So you can see a clear increase in sea level in those areas. However, what we found out is that when you actually, so these tide gauge stations also were connected to satellite altimetry, which means that they actually could measure the vertical movement of the soil of the ground the tide gauge station was standing on. So if we correct the measurement of the sea level in those areas with the vertical movement of the ground where the tide gauge station are located, we can actually see in the orange part of the graph that there is not so much a sea level change happening. It's fairly leveled. I mean, projecting to the future, definitely there's going to be some sea level change, but for the moment, it's not much happening. And yet, when we go to Semarang, when we go to Jakarta, we see that everything seems to be sinking. And that really indicates that the main problem today in Semarang is land subsidence. So really the lowering of the soil, which is caused by groundwater extraction, surface load, etc. And the results you can see here in these pictures that is very constant flooding, daily flooding due to tidal movements that is worsening every year. And you can see also in the buildings, especially in the coastal areas, that they seem very, very tiny. And when I went first there, I was very surprised. But actually, what happens is that people have to elevate the roads in front of their houses, have to elevate the floor in their houses in order to be above sea level, and that's what they keep on doing as long as they can. Next slide, please. So yeah, there's a few more examples of what you can see. So for example, in the top left corner, you see a picture of a road that has been elevated with houses around that haven't been elevated yet. So there's always the struggle of the people living there that they kind of have to keep up with roads that are being elevated by the municipality, and the houses have to be done privately. Next slide, please. So yeah, to pick up what Boris talked about earlier, so what options do people actually have to deal with the situation? I mean, obviously, you cannot stay in one place forever if your house is gone at some point. So obviously, from the municipality of Semarang, there are some plans in place, large infrastructure project like the big Garuda seawall that was planned to really have some protecting infrastructure, or retreat will be an option, or accommodation if you could carry on, please. Yes. Yeah, that's fine. Perfect. So can you go one back, please? Thank you. So what we found is that as protection measures, there are some things in place in local communities, but they don't seem to work on a general level for the whole coastal area. In some parts, we do have mangrove plantation, which seem to help a lot against coastal erosion, which also dampens the effect of land subsidence in some parts. Retreat away from these coastal areas not an option. Like they would only leave if they really, really had to. This has to do with a lot of different reasons. One reason might be that they are a lot of fishing communities and they need to be close to the coast. Other reasons might be they own the land that is sinking, and if they are left without their house, without their ground where they live, they are without any financial means. And obviously, they cannot sell their plot of land because it's going to be gone in 5 years if nobody does something about it. And another reason is these communities have found ways to live with the floods on a daily basis, which enables them to stay there, and they want to stay because of those social networks, because of those social communities. And I want to dive into this a bit further. You can go continue, please. Yes. So what people do, they are affected on an almost daily basis by flooding, and what they do is they accommodate. So they try to find daily practices that they do every day. So if the floor is flooded, they take off their shoes. If they try to clean up between, they help each other. That's the main thing that's happening. So if somebody is affected by flooding, they contribute money, collect donations within the community, and try to help each other through labor, through donations of food, clothing, or money. And what we found in our household survey that we did there, that the largest part of the communities contribute to community works as a collective effort to save their residents, essentially. Next slide, please. Click through it so you can see. Yeah. So specifically, what we were looking at is the importance of those social networks. So we were talking about social capital here. Those people living here, they don't have a lot of financial capital. We're talking about rather poor communities, don't have a lot of physical or financial means, but what they do have a lot of is capital. So that means all the people they know in their communities, the neighbors, the families, their friends, all of them can contribute to working together and garnering resources in order to stay in the place. That's what we call social capital, which is a connection of uh, shared norms and values, the belonging to a place, spatial features as well, and the setup of the networks where they live in. So we look at it from this perspective that the ability to actually stay in those places is very much decided by the social capital that they have in their place. Can you go one further, please? Yes, and So social capital provides the access and support and resources for those people to actually deal with flooding on a daily basis. Can you go to the next slide, please? And now to connect it to the larger discussion of migration that we had earlier. So one thing that we were specifically interested in is the role of so-called translocal social capital. So if you look at this graph, in the top part is a representation of different social networks. So if you look at location A, you would have a network, and within then you have some friends, some neighbors, and they have a certain type of resources. What we also found in Semarang, for example. But these resources are limited. And especially imagine, I mean, daily flooding, they can deal with pretty fine. But imagine there's during monsoon season, during high tides, during very extreme floods, they might not be able to help themselves anymore. Obviously, because if everybody is affected, how can they help each other? I mean, obviously they do, but it might be too much to deal with them themselves. So uh, what can happen is if you have translocal social capital, that actually just means that you know people who live in other places. They might not be affected by the same disasters or by the same hazards as you are, and they might contribute in a different way. They might be able to provide you with shelter because they're not affected by a flood. They might be able to send money to you. They might be able to actually move to a different town to get a better education than they would have in their place of origin in order to help them through knowledge or getting resources or different things that could help their families in the place of origin to help them. Can you please continue? One more, please. Yes, and migration is in the literature considered as the most influential one to actually create a flow of financial and social remittances in a sense. Because if you think about yourself, the people that you may know who live in other parts of Indonesia, maybe even other parts of the world, the people you have closest contact to, I would assume, is family or very close friends. So migration from households, from families to other places creates translocal social networks that might be beneficial to adaptation in these coastal areas. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. One back, please. Perfect. So we were looking at the people in Samarang that we did the survey with, and we asked them, how many people do you know in other places? Who are these people? What do they do? Etc. Etc. And we found a correlation that people who had more contacts, who lived outside their own residential area, their own city, that they actually were more likely to put in place proactive measures to protect themselves of hazards compared to those people who don't. Uh, and that is surprising, especially in Semarang, because people that we talked to had a very highly sedentary community. They really didn't want to go. But yet still, if they had those connections, they were much more likely to receive, or that's at least hypothesized. That's what we're going to look at, actually, what we're here to find more about this in detail, that they are able to gain more resources from the outside that enables them to deal with coastal hazards in the place. So we also found that there's a very strong correlation between financial and human capital, so the education and the financial resources that they have, and the amount of translocal context that you have, which makes sense because migration can be expensive. Like if you want to take up an education in another place, first of all, you would have to find the means to move to that place, find accommodation, to pay for education, etc., etc. And that constitutes a problem because the most affected are the poor communities who do not have these financial and human resources to build up these communities, to construct these translocal networks, to create them themselves. Next slide, please. So, as a summary for our Indonesian case study, the retreat or migration is rather uncommon. People really tend to stay in their place of living, which also has to do with where we did our study. I mean, we were looking at Jakarta and we're looking at Semarang Bay area, which is a place of large immigration. Actually, people come there. What was also talked about, they move from low risk areas to high risk areas, and they want to stay there because there they have better chances to diversify and to uphold their livelihood. Social capital in this case study was very crucial for adaptive responses of those people. That translocal social capital, so migration-induced connections that people have, is a very positive influence on proactive hazard responses. And that leaves us with the idea or the conclusion that migration can serve as a very important driver to build adaptive capacity to, in this case, coastal hazards, but in general, environmental hazards in total. But the largest problem that we have and the largest barrier that we would have to overcome for people to improve these types of adaptations is poverty. So from a policy perspective, like the largest thing that you would have to tackle is poverty reduction. And I think that's about it from this Indonesian case. And I would give back to Boris to present the final case study in Bangladesh.
Yeah, thank you very much, Konstantin. So what we can say is actually, if you look at these two case studies, North Java and West African coast, you see we have a fundamental change of the environmental situation, but people react in different ways. In Africa, a lot of them migrate. So actually, adaptation is done by migration, whereas in Indonesia, on the north coast of Java, people tend to stay and tend to accommodate to the changes they are living in. So that's an obvious difference. And that shows you that we can't a short line between a causal relationship between an environmental change and the reactions of people. These reactions are very, very different between West Africa and Indonesia, even though the situation along the coast is not completely similar, but very close to each other. So obviously, cultural factors, economic factors play a substantial role on how people react. And another thing we could also learn from that migration is a way to adapt. Of course, point one, you can escape the situation that's problematic for you, obviously adaptation. But the second maybe more important point from the case study that Konstantin reported is that migration is a good way to adapt, because through migration, people build up knowledge networks that can actually help to adopt better in the place where they are. And that makes it very attractive as a way to adapt to these changes. But yes, of course, it's very different in different parts of the world. Let us come to our last case study. And now I think we have to speed up a little bit, and this might give Lars a hard time. Sorry for that, to clicking through all these slides. But you see here a picture of the coast. Go back one picture, please. Again, the other one, please. One more minute on this one. The next one. No, the one before, please. Going back to sorry. Okay. Because you can see how the situation looks there. So it's a constant change between water and land, water and land, water and land. And you can see almost from this image taken along the coast from Bangladesh, that this is a problematic situation, this mix between water and land that you have everywhere. Second point I want to point out, usually we work in large international research consortia. So we, in my working group, sometimes are only one of 9 or 20 teams that work on the same issue. And the results I present you now on Bangladesh are results from the US, USA, French, German, Bangladeshi, and Australian research network that were doing this research along the Bangladesh coast together. Our close collaboration partner was development studies at the State University of Ohio in Columbus, in the US. So we were the social science from Germany, and we had another social science team from the US, and I try to present our collective results. US-German cooperation. This was part of the Belmont Forum. I don't know if you heard about Belmont Forum. The Belmont Forum is a research branch, you could say, of the G7 most important economic powers. You know that we have the G20 summit now on Bali, and there's also a G7 summit of the seven most important economies of the world, and they fund international research projects on issues on environmental change, climate change, and sustainability. So that's born in this context. Next slide, please. Bangladesh is interesting because Bangladesh is the nightmare country reported in mass media. This is just from Reuters. They're a very reliable source, I should say. And they are talking about 20 million Bangladeshis that have to leave the villages, the towns where they live in the next decade. Some other sources talk about 40, 50 million people on the move because of climate change and sea level rise. Theoretically a massive problem. Just one example of that. You can find many more examples. When you look at this more closely, you see that these were mostly wrong figures from the mid-1990s that are repeated time and time again, and we actually don't know if there will be 20, 30, or 40, or 50 million refugees. These are also only comes from the first studies in the 1990s, 20, 30 years old research that is repeated again and again in mass media. And we ask the question, is this really true? I mean, are these figures really plausible? And probably they are not. And I will show you why. Next slide. Yeah, we saw this satellite image before. You see this flat delta area with these huge rivers. And we know that about the most of the country of Bangladesh, the whole state, is below 10 meters above sea level. The whole country very close to this. And about 40 to 50 million people are living in the coastal area of Bangladesh. This could be affected in future. So it's really a highly vulnerable situation. That's why many people say the Ganges Brahmaputra Delta or the state of Bangladesh are a multi-risk area, an ideal case, so to say, of a multi-risk area. You have coastal flooding, you have river flooding, you have rain flooding there, you have tropical cyclones there, you have in the dry season tornadoes there. So Bangladesh has almost everything in a changing climate system that could affect people. And therefore, of course, it's one of these highly debated areas. No. Next slide. This is the traditional site. Looks familiar to you. In Bali, you have hills and valleys. In Bangladesh is more flat. It's basically rice cultivation. Not very surprising. Next picture. I don't want to go just in this detail, but you could say with multi-hazard. What we face in the coastal areas are three most important issues. Climate change and sea level rise is, so to say, is the backdrop of it. But what can people really experience are tropical cyclones, river floods, coastal floods, and riverbank erosion. So these big rivers, these wide rivers, they always change their course every year with every monsoon season. And so they're always changing land and water. And people might lose their fields, their paddies to the river, and some new land is created at a different location. So people have always to move because these rivers are shifting their course almost every year. So these most important impacts we have: tropical cyclones, river flood, coastal flood, and riverbank erosion that actually changes the environment where people live in all the time. Next slide, please. If you look at the flooded area in Bangladesh, and you really have to digest this data that you see here, it's almost impossible to understand in other parts of the world what's happening there. It's almost impossible in Germany, but I guess also almost impossible in Indonesia. What you see here are the years from 1954 to 2014. Not quite recent. The problem is that the data collection system changed in 2014, so the newer data is not that comparable to the old data. But that doesn't matter. You see the flooded area, the peak flooded area in Bangladesh for many years from the 1950s. And you have the percentages of affected territory of Bangladesh. And if you look at the year 1998, that means almost 70% of the whole territory of Bangladesh was flooded for 2.5 months, the height of 1, 2, 3, up to 5 meters. Imagine what that means. You only have to live on 30% of your territory because the rest is underwater for 2.5 months. Imaginable from a perspective from Europe, and also unimaginable from a perspective from Indonesia. These are massive changes that the people have to face every year. And then the question, of course, is there a climate change in this state? If you look at the peak flooded area from year to year, you can't see really a climate change influence in it. So the long-term average is about 20% maximum submerged area every monsoon period. So it's not a different in the long-term average trend, but you can still see an influence of climate change because the extreme values are much higher and much lower than in the past. And that's problematic for Bangladesh because Bangladesh needs flood to sustain its agricultural value, to sustain the next harvest. Because in the dry season, which is quite long, about half a year in Bangladesh, or even longer, 8, 9 months sometimes, you need this heavy rains during the monsoon to keep the soil and the water available for rice paddies in the dry season. So it's important for Bangladesh that you have some extent of flooding. So 20% are the perfect flood level. And you see the problem. Since the 1980s, these extreme values are getting much more pronounced compared to the past. That means you have a dry year with a drought, you have a year with severe flood, dry year, severe flood, and so on. So Bangladesh moves away from this perfect sweet spot of 20% flooded area. And you see, it's not only the long-term average, which doesn't move, also about the variance of this rainfall and flood data from year to year. And then you can actually see a signal of climate change already going back to the 1980s to our next slide. Then cyclone. This is a couple of pictures from the last cyclone, the last completely severe cyclone in 2007. You see about almost 4,000 people died at that time. You had almost 20,000 people severely injured. So this has an impact. This is a tropical cyclones that develop over the Bay of Bengal and then move north and hit the coast of eastern India, Bangladesh, and the north coast and the central coast of Burma, of Myanmar. This is also the area of these cyclones that develop over the Bay of Bengal. When you think of climate change physically, you would say, if the climate is changing, if we have a temperature rise, then we should have more cyclones, because more temperature over the Bay of Bengal means more energy in the system, means more cyclones, and means faster cyclones. Funny thing is wrong. The surprising is this doesn't happen. Physically, the explanation is perfect, but we just can't observe that. Next slide, please. The first perspective is how many people are affected. The number of people that are affected is going down very quickly in Bangladesh. So in the mid-1970s, Bangladesh has a severe cyclone. 300,000 people died in a couple of hours, in one night. 1990, there was another severe cyclone, about the same dimension of the cyclone in the mid-70s. 140,000 people died in 6 or 7 hours, very quickly. 2007, Peter, again, comparable size cyclone, about 4,000 people died. So the death toll is actually going down very quickly, and this is true with two effects. One is cyclone shelters. Looks pretty much similar, I guess, than a tsunami cyclone shelter in Indonesia. So the wave can run under the building. The second is a much better forecasting system that gives lead time to people to know when the cyclone will hit. Next slide, please. These are the wind speeds of major cyclones from Bangladesh from 2006 to 2007. That was the last severe cyclone sidereal images. Was 3 minutes ago. Can you see an influence of climate change? No. And that's surprising, because physically, it's completely logical that you should have more cyclones in Bangladesh, but we haven't. We can't observe that. So this shows us that we still don't completely understand the physics of climate change, because you should expect something very, very different. Even in the years after, following 2007, the cyclone intensity is actually decreasing in Bangladesh. It's increasing in the Caribbean. It's increasing along the south coast of the US. It's decreasing in Bangladesh, and we just don't know why. So you see, also from the physical perspective, there's a lot of things we actually can't actually tell of these changes. Physically, totally logical kind of calculations, but we can't observe in the real world. But I don't want to go into detail with that. But you see, also cyclones are affecting this population, and cyclones, of course, are related somehow to climate change. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just a few pictures of riverbank erosion, but I don't want to go into detail. But you see, obviously, from these pictures, riverbank erosion plays an important role in changes to the environment that we live in. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are, say, the cyclone path. Sorry, that's in German, but this is the cyclone path of the last cyclones that you see here, always coming from the Bay of Bengal, then moving mostly to the northeast. And you see these risk areas. So you have this red risk area, we have a risk of the flood wave coming with the cyclone. We have this orange zone, which is kind of a transition zone where you usually don't face the flood more, but still a strong wind. And then you have a yellow zone where your risk is a bit Yeah, next. Yeah, and so what we did in Bangladesh, we did study migration, and we tried to find out the link between environmental change, this is massive here and very unstable for people, and if people migrate as a reaction. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is a map, probably not, can't see it very good, but this is a map that our American colleagues produced. They took population increase and decrease maps on a very small spatial scale called unions in Bangladesh. That's kind of almost villages, a very, very high resolution of this data. This is basically data from the Bangladeshi Bureau of Statistics from 2001 to 2011. We're still waiting on the new census data from 2021, but it's not calculated yet. So we have to rely on this older data. What you see in red are villages or unions with an increase in population, and what you see in blue is villages and unions with a decrease of population. This is not, to get this right, this is not migration data. This is the number of people changing from 2001 to 2011. And you are geography students, I guess, so you know population change has two components. One is the natural component, birth and death, and another component is migration, immigration and immigration. So in this data, that we have to keep in mind is the effect of natural population change, of death and birth. But the situation is as such, this doesn't really, it's not very different between different unions. So the birth and death relationship is pretty much the same in all these areas. So the most important contribution to this population change is actually migration. It's not migration data, but it's very close. But we don't have good migration data to rely on this kind of proxy variable. Don't want to go into too much detail because in actual fact, it doesn't matter that. But geography students should ask these questions. All migration, no, it's also the natural birth rate effect, but not too very high. And this picture is totally surprising because what you see is most of the villages closer to coast gain population, whereas the areas with a population loss are more in the hinterland, where you don't have this strong effect of cyclones and of coastal flooding. Exactly in these areas where people move to, you obviously have these problems. In other areas, more inland in the more secure location, if you will, there you have this population decrease. So obviously, what's going on along the coast is not a major driver for population development, which is completely surprising. All the experts that saw this data were extremely surprised because they all expected something very, very different. And this is the first indication that obviously to explain migration in this area, where we all discuss about climate refuge, is not because of climate change or environmental change, but obviously something else has to be the reason. Right. And this is the reason. The integration of the Bangladeshi economy in world economy. This drives these changes. So there's a high demand, or the high demand from the 1980s in America, in Japan, and in Western Europe for tropical shrimps. Just our diet changed. And there's a high demand for shrimps, and so many rice farms along in the coastal Bangladesh were transformed into shrimp farms. Shrimp farms need much less labor than rice. For the diet of these people in both Bangladesh, shrimps are not important at all. It's only an export good. They all sell it to other countries. So rice would be much more important. So two things happened. People lost their jobs because of transformation from rice farming to shrimp farming. And the base for the diet was just gone. And Bangladesh in these parts of the country was not able to produce enough rice for this population. And so people have to leave because the local situation of their diet, of agricultural production. And you see, in an area where we all discuss about the impact of climate change is not a trigger for migration. Obviously, it's something very, very different. We could say economic globalization is a driver, even though this is a highly affected area of climate change. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, you can, as you see, this is the whole extent. A lot of areas of coastal Bangladesh are now flooded to salt water. So just people try to get in the flood water, bring high tide, then have barriers that the water can't flow back, and they try to bring salt water up and up and up in their country to farm saltwater shrimps there. Only because of the economic changes and the dietary changes in America, in Japan, and Western Europe. This is driving, because this is the economic opportunity. And then you see rice paddies, a lot of labor. You know this probably much better than I do. And shrimp farms, you only need one manager, and you can observe a whole territory. You lose all the jobs that rice production produce. Next slide, please. We can skip that. I mean, it's only more detailed about the shrimp industry. We don't have to look at this in detail. We can also skip this one. So what we did a huge survey together with American colleagues. So we gathered information about more than 6,000 people living in coastal Bangladesh with a long questionnaire, interviews of 1 to 2 hours. A lot of information about 6,000 people, about their adaptation strategies, about how they face climate change, about migrating family members, and so on. And you can only see here 2 of these charts. The first chart is the main reason for migration. So people were asked, do you have migrants in your family? And for these migrants in the family, what was the main reason for them to leave this area, to migrate to another place? I don't want to go into detail, but the surprising thing is almost everybody said economic reasons or education. So these family members moved to another location, mostly the state capital of Dhaka, for getting a better job there, for a better income there. Or my son and my daughter go to Dhaka or to other cities in Bangladesh to study there, go to college, to university. Then another important reason were women that married a man. In the tradition of Bangladesh, they have to move to the household of the man. So some women left the area because of marriage. And then we also asked, are there environmental change reasons, climate change reasons for you, like riverbank erosion, like cyclones, like losing farmland, and so on? We actually gave them a long list and asked, could this be one of the reasons? The interesting thing was, not one person, not one family said this was a reason to migrate. So for them, the environmental change, the climate change, the cyclones were no reason to migrate, not for one of them. Among 6,000 people, not one person was migrating, they asked for, because of environmental change. Again, think of this 50 million people of climate refugees, and you can't find one person that actually gives this reason for migration. We would be bad social scientists, bad human geographers, if we just accept. We try to search further for explanation, not just asking people directly, but we can say that if you ask people directly, in their own opinion, environmental change, climate change, hazards, no reason to migrate. No, not one person, not one single case. Even fact that shouldn't be too many, but this was really surprising. The other the chart says the type of migration. That means only migration within Bangladesh, is migration to the next village, is migration to another country. And the other aspect was it permanent migration? Did these people go forever? Or was it just seasonal migration, going and coming back every year? For example, working in a city as a laborer during the dry season and coming back in the monsoon season for agricultural work in their village. Again, a very clear picture. Almost nobody migrated internationally. These climate refugees don't exist, so to say, if you ask them, because they're not going to other countries. Usually it's only short distance migration, and usually it's only temporary migration. So what's often discussed in Europe and North America is millions of climate refugees over longer distances forever in another country is a very small fraction of the population. And even in the small fraction, nobody was migrating because of the environment. Next slide. Then there's a long debate in migration and environmental change research. Who are the migrants? Are the migrants the poor people that don't have another chance, they have to go because there's no other way for them to continue to live in this area, or are richer people, better educated people migrate. Our data is also pretty clear in this respect. Better off migrate. More money is more social capital, knowing to migrate. So the more resourceful are the migrants. It's not the poorest of the people that migrate because they just can't afford to migrate. They have to find other ways to deal with it. So if we have migrants, the more from a well-off part of the population than the poorest of the poor. What you would expect when you talk about these climate refugees. You would expect the people most affected are the migrants, but it's not the case. It's these people that have resources. And social capital is certainly a good explanation. Not only your financial means that you have, but also the networks that help you to migrate to other places. This was kind of another an interesting point in the study, and we can say, yes, it's more the resourceful. Next slide, please. But then, as I said, ask people directly is a very simple way to find out information. And if you stop at this point, you would say climate refugees, climate migrants don't exist because we didn't find a climate migrant. What we then did is more kind of econometric statistical approach. We did a multi-level regression analysis to find out hidden motives of people that they don't know themselves, but we could find out through regression calculations in advanced statistical methods. Multi-level very shortly means it's kind of a statistical model calculating methods with a lot of variables, which thinks that individuals are nested in their families, and these families are nested in their village. So it always is an impact of the next larger community. But I don't want, not that, but it shows you that if you want to find out more about this and just asking people and collecting their responses, it gets statistically very, very complex. But that's the way where we are in science, that we have to apply these highly advanced statistical models to actually find out more about these relationships. So this is basically a description of the model. So we have different groups of factors, and we have different variables that actually are indicators for these social factors. And we try to find out, or we tried to find out, what are the most important drivers for migration. And you see environmental stressors, also a group of influential variables in the model. Next slide, please. So when we do that, and I don't want to go into detail, we can see the next slide. It's probably too detailed for us at the moment. Next slide, please. What does this mean? Advanced statistical calculation. So one result was, yes, even if you do it in a very sophisticated analytical process, still the result holds that it's mostly economic reasons why people migrate. But when you put this data into a statistical model, you find out that there's a second contributing factor, and this could be environmental change. It's much weaker than the first one, and therefore for people's perception, it's not important. But you can find out through this advanced statistical methods that there is a slight effect of this environmental change, of climate change. It's not the major one. It's much smaller than the economic effect, but it's still there. So this is one way to find out, and people just tell you. Then second is that individual resources play a role, and that individual resources, social resources, financial resources are important for migration. Rising result, but this was also supported by statistical analysis. And then thirdly, through the statistical analysis, we actually found that we have a certain impact of migration of the poor. It's not dominant, but if you look at it very closely, if you actually see this as a second line of explanation, that of course this last resort sees as we called it. So migration, because there is no other option anymore, is a slightly explaining these migration processes that are going on. So you see, with more advanced statistical methods, you can find out much more than just asking people and collect their responses directly. Next slide, please. Another modern method is utilizing mobile phone data. Another research group, American Chinese research group, they actually used mobile phone data. And mobile phone data is fascinating for migration studies, because you can actually follow people in real time moving through space. And this is very intelligent. So they actually had a the cyclone. And they were actually observing this movement of people in the cyclone-affected areas through their mobile phone data, because people that move away because there's a cyclone always use their mobile phone. So you always know where they are with this data. And they actually found out that when a cyclone hits an area with villages, people leave because of the cyclone. But after 6 weeks, almost everybody was back where they started from and rebuilt their villages. So yes, there was migration, but it's very temporary, only for about 6 weeks, and then almost everybody went back to this village, to rebuild the village and to continue to live there. So you see, this real-time tracking of people is another very intelligent way to find more out in migration. Quite a lot of development, and therefore every week, every month, or every week, a lot of studies actually are published around the world from academics doing these migration studies, because now we have more statistical techniques. We also have new data that we can use for these studies and then track people real time. Next slide, please. Yeah, is there an impact of climate change? That's now the question. But it sounds, because the story sounds very simple. No, climate change doesn't affect people very much. But we know that climate change in the future could be much more severe than the climate change we had in the past. So we can assume that climate change will impact these migration patterns, but it's far from clear how it will impact migration patterns. And if you have this situation that you just don't know exactly, I think it's not very responsible to talk about 50 million climate refugees if you have no idea how it works. No idea. Very little idea, or still too little idea. Second point is that socioeconomic changes might be also in future might be much more important for people's vulnerability than the climate system. It has an impact, but it's probably not the most contributing factor for mass migration. Next slide, please. So what are the conclusions? I think one conclusion could be there's no such simple construct as climate refugees. Forget about climate refugees. Don't use the term anymore in any decent academic debate. Something that either doesn't exist, from a law perspective, they just don't exist, and from a scientific perspective, we don't know exactly about them. So climate refugees actually is an oversimplification of a much more complex process, and therefore probably not a term that maybe don't. Highly problematic. Then migration is an adaptation strategy. Another result. Yes, migration can be a positive adaptation strategy because you avoid the problems in the place where you live, or because you build up networks, knowledge networks that can actually help you to adapt better in future. Next, I think next message of our research, from my perspective, is that people tend to translate environmental change in economic change, and they react on economic variables, even though the economic variable could be a dependent variable of environmental change. Sounds a bit abstract, kind of thing. If you lose your land, or your land is soil, you lose soil fertility, or you lose your land due to riverbank erosion, then for people that's economic impact, because it lowers their chances of a next good harvest. So it's an economic problem for them. And therefore, it's very logical that if you ask people, what are the reasons for you to leave the area, they tell you about economic reasons. But sometimes this is only translation of ecological change to economic change, because this is the precondition for economic success. So to your conditions or your environment conditions surrounding you. Then there are significant resource-related barriers to migration. So people that want to migrate might not be able to do that. So the migrants are the better off people, and it's not the people that are actually would be most necessary that we migrate as an adaptation. Then the next, I think the next message from this research is that adaptive capacity is extremely important. There are many ways for people to adapt where they live, but we have to help them to develop these adaptive capacities wherever we can. I think for the most part, we could say, and that's probably not surprising in then Passar and for you as an audience, but it's very surprising often for an audience in the US or in West Europe. These people in Bangladesh, these people in West Africa, these people in Indonesia, These are very rational individual decisions. It's much more than just running away from a problem. People see their chances, their options, the risk, and actually balance out risk and chances, and they do it everywhere. And this is basically also results. So the whole migration process is much more rational than many simple stories of climate refugees want to tell us. And we should be more sensitive if we hear these stories. Next slide, please. And one important message is also in for us as academics, as researchers in this field. Maybe it's more important to study why people are not able to migrate. So it would be much more sensible in the future to study non-migrants, to study migration. And we ask migrants about migration, but maybe the people that are not able to migrate are a much more problematic group and could be much more in the focus of our research. So also I did the wrong thing in the past, very often. And it's the whole debate about trapped populations. I don't know if you heard about this debate. This is also a part from the Foresight report from 2011 already, 11 years old, which actually defines trapped population by people that should migrate because they're highly vulnerable to these changes, but not able to migrate because of missing financial and social resources. So they're trapped should migrate, but they're not able to do it. I think this is also a future of migration research. To not study migrants, but to study non-migrants and to find out the reasons why one of the adaptation options is actually locked for them. Can't use it because they're not able to use this adaptation. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think most of the things I already said. Yeah, of course, in the future, climate change will have an impact on migration. No doubt about it. Because sea level rise will accelerate, temperature rise will accelerate, and most likely flooding will accelerate, and also tropical cyclones will accelerate, and also riverbank erosion. All these factors that people face might be more severe in the future than in the past. So yes, climate change will have more impact on migration and adaptation strategies in the future. But a number of parts. We learned that migration is not a monocausal process, a highly complex. We learned that migration is the usual way to organize your life. So families in Bangladesh, for example, or West Africa, will always use that sons and daughters went to go to another location, send back remittances, and so livelihoods were organized in families. So what we often find is that this environmental impact is only a disturbance factor for a migration system that's already in place, with or without. Then we see that's almost impossible to disentangle environmental from economic reasons. Very hard to say what is economic, what is environmental, because these translation processes. So, and we have to remind you that, or remind ourselves, that migration is only one way of adapting, plus many others, accommodation and protection. And the last word, please be careful when you listen to these stories that tell you about millions of migrants. Think twice. And if you think twice, you see it's not that easy as it seems on first sight. And I think that's very important for us as human geographers and social scientists, very careful about this oversimplified stories that we often. But I don't say that we don't have climate change. I only say that climate change and social change is not so directly linked as many people like. Now, the last slide, I guess. Yeah, thank you very much for your patience, also in the name of Constance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown and Konstantin, for the very nice presentations. Before we enter the discussions, I would like to deliver some quick conclusion in bahasa. Jadi Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan mahasiswa yang terhormat, tadi sudah dijelaskan tentang bagaimana pengaruh bencana pesisir ya, atau bahaya bencana pesisir terhadap adaptasi masyarakat dan lingkungan di 3 negara. Ada Bangladesh, Ghana, dan Indonesia. Kita lihat bagaimana masyarakat memiliki adaptasi yang berbeda-beda terhadap bencana pesisir kaitannya dengan perubahan iklim. Misalnya di Ghana, masyarakat memutuskan untuk pindah ke negara tetangganya ya, international migration, migrasi internasional dari Ghana dan ke negara tetangganya. dan bagaimana pemerintah itu membangun sebuah pengaman di laut ya untuk mengamankan negaranya, tapi sepertinya juga belum maksimal. Kemudian di Indonesia di Semarang, bagaimana masyarakat itu bertahan ya, mereka tidak pindah dari desanya atau dari rumahnya ke tempat lain atau bahkan pindah ke negara lain karena beberapa alasan juga, mungkin dari beberapa alasan memang rumah keluarganya dan sebagainya, dan mereka beradaptasi dengan misalnya menaikkan fondasi rumah ya, walaupun rumahnya kecil tapi fondasinya dinaikkan, walaupun terkadang ada kendala bahwa jalanan itu sudah diperbaiki dulu oleh pemerintah desa, justru rumahnya menjadi lebih rendah ya, dan mereka harus berlomba-lomba menaikkan rumahnya sebelum misalnya air laut itu masuk. Dan di Bangladesh ya, bagaimana perpindahan masyarakat kaitannya dengan perubahan iklim dan juga siklon itu, mereka beradaptasi dengan migrasi secara sementara ke kota ya, mencari pekerjaan dan sebagainya, terus mereka balik lagi ke desa ataupun tempat asalnya. Dan terkaitannya dengan di lingkungan mereka, daerah yang memang terkena banjir ataupun terkena siklon malah berubah dari sawah yang bersih padi itu menjadi tambak udang ya. Itu yang menariknya bagaimana adaptasi di 3 negara ini berbeda-beda katanya dengan bencana ataupun bahaya yang ada di pesisir katanya dengan perubahan iklim. Itu sedikit dari kesimpulan kita kuliah ini dalam bahasa Indonesia. Before we start the discussion session, I would like to start the discussion. I would like to know much more about the Bangladesh situation to Professor Brown. As we see, Bangladesh is kind of a unique country with a large amount of population and very tight spaces. And on your presentation, you said that the community are doing a temporary migrations just to the capital from some reason like education or family. So how do you think that after the migration, the people will come back to their village or their union in the coastal area, and how do they adapt to the coastal hazard like a cyclone or something that threat their lives and the environment as we see? And on your slide, this migration is adaptation to environmental changes, and how do these temporary migrations create adaptation for the community that lives in the coastal area? And to Constantine, I would like to know much more about the social capital here. As we see, as your slides, your presentation, you said that the social capital that people in Semarang tend to stay on their houses, and they usually have they have working together in the community like weekly or hourly. So in Java and as well as in Bali, we know that the working together has already become the culture of the people, especially in Central Java and Yogyakarta. As I studying there and also in Bali. So how do you think the culture will affect the social capital of people, especially in Java and in Bali? That's my question. I believe we have another one question from. Probably you can try to answer that. Yeah. Before the student probably have their own questions.
Before we forget the first question, be careful. Yeah, these temporary migrants from Bangladesh, this was the first question. I mean, they're different people. So, I mean, there's a small fraction that actually goes to mostly to Europe, some of them to Canada, some of them to Australia too. And they're mostly from richer families. This is my rich families in the countryside, but also in the cities. And they send their sons, sometimes their daughters, but mostly their sons to European countries. And these sons then contribute to the family, come back in Bangladesh by remittance. So Italy, for example, is one of the most important countries. Why, I don't know, but Italy is a very important country for Bangladesh in migration. And these are mostly these better educated people from richer families. Then you have this permanent migration of migrants that actually migrate seasonally. Very often, for example, you saw these brick factories. Usually they stock up their employees by people from rural areas, from the coastal areas. So in the dry season, they work in these brickworks, in these brick factories, and in the wet season, they go back to the village to help with rice cultivation, for example. So we have actually a seasonal migration, half a year here, half a year here, so a couple of months there and a couple of months where, in their villages. So these are the two major types, whereas the second type is, in numbers, is much, much more important than the first. So, and they actually contribute by knowledge. Of these sons that go to Italy or maybe also to other countries in Europe or North America, they learn how about climate change. They know about how you can adopt to climate change from a different perspective because in a different environment, and report this back home. This is exactly this mechanism that that Konstantin was talking about in Indonesia. Of course, it also exists in West Africa and in Bangladesh as well. And the other is financially. They brought their families back home. This is very often, and then of course you have a third group, these kind of permanent migrants that are students or PhD students. They go to another country for 3 or 4 years to do their master's degree or PhD degree, and then they go back to their home country. But these people very rarely go back to the village. They then actually stay in the bigger cities because their better education is much more important for the labor market. How do they contribute? Home economy, I guess, by knowledge transfer, actually, and by financial means. And if poverty is one of the major problems that we have to solve to make people more adaptable to these environmental changes, then reducing poverty through additional income sources is a very clever thing to do. And these people are clever. They do exactly that. So migration in Bangladesh, and also applies to many other regions of the world, not only started because of environmental change or climate change. It's a much older system to very cleverly improve your family income. And people act as kind of economic units in their family. So in my view, this environmental impact, this climate change impact, is only a modification of a migration pattern that already existed before of social and economic reasons. I hope this is sufficient. And this leads also to social capital.
Thank you. So I will address the question about the social capital in Semarang. So what we found, as I told before, so you have those coastal communities that are very strongly bonded, very coherent. So you see in those communities that they usually follow the same profession. They are culturally, religiously very similar to each other, which helps them to be very close. So one thing that's very important for them is go to community meetings, go to meetings of their within their kilurahan, within their RW, RT, within the PKK. So these are all meetings that build and strengthen their community ties within them. And these are also, in that case study, the basis of community efforts and collective action, doing weekly gotong royong, doing other things that improve life in the community to start and enhance and maintain community projects that help them in their daily lives. And as an extension of that, also flooding, because they have to deal with that as well. So what it leads to is what we call bonding social capital. So it's the capital between people who are very close to you. So it's your family, your immediate neighbors, and people who are just very much like you. You're like your peers. So for example, you are a group of students, so you are more likely to be friends with other students than maybe a rice farmer who lives in Sumatra. Makes sense, right? But so that's a very good thing because it gives you very strong connections to people. You can build trust with them. You can build reciprocity with them. You can share your resources and be sure that you will return it when you are in need. The only downside that we found, especially in the case of Semarang, is that their social capital, their networks are so cohesive, so strong that there's very little impact from the outside. So that means that as soon as the community resources are used up, that it's very hard for actually to deal with them with the situation anymore. So then we have different processes going on that we looked further into. So for example, the role of community leaders, so the role of the heads of PKK, LTMK, Kilurahan, etc., in their way, because they are connected to higher administrative levels and they're connected to other communities. And through those key brokers, gatekeepers, that actually communities could be able to get more resources inside to overcome their own limitations. And yes, very interesting question also, the differences in, well, now we know the Javanese context. And to be honest, we don't know as much yet about the Balinese context because we just started our research here. But that's the main reason. We want to see if there are actually big differences, or what actually the local culture, community, social networks that make up for a difference in the social capital, and then extension of that on their reactions to how they actually deal with flooding. So this is why we're here. So this week we're in Bali and starting our research here, and next week we're going to go to West Sumatra to Padang, and we're trying to do there the exactly same. And hopefully, or that's what we're very interested in, to actually follow up with this research and see if we can, within Indonesian context, so you all are a country, but between the islands, between the provinces, that there are social and cultural differences, and we want to see if that makes a difference in fact. We want to find that out.
Thank you very much for the explanations. We'll move to do we have two questions in the feedback chat room? The first question I think already been answered. The mangrove have role in reducing coastal hazard. So I just start to the second question. Indonesia is an archipelagic country consisting of small islands. What should be done to reduce coastal hazard due to current climate change? Probably the connection between the maps that you show that recent sea level rise is located in small islands in Maluku in the north part of Indonesia. And so the question is, what should be done to reduce coastal hazard due to current climate change, especially in small islands? Thank you.
It's a very good question. It's a very broad question. I barely dare to give a definitive answer to this question because obviously, as I just said, Indonesia is big with lots and lots of different islands, different cultures, different community makeups. But one conclusion that we can draw from our research so far, which was very much focused on the community perspective, so from the bottom up, that oftentimes top-down measures, projects, trying to help people do not actually listen to the needs of the people in the place. So sometimes what was happening was forced relocation of people. And I mean, if that's necessary, if there's no land left where the people can live, obviously that's an option. But what often happened is that they would be moved into different, relocation areas where they were not paying attention to the community structure. So parts of different neighborhoods were just thrown together. Nobody knows each other, and all your friends are suddenly living in this completely different part of the city. And like, what are you gonna do? You're a fisherman. You still kind of need to fulfill your livelihood still. So I think there has to be obviously a combination of mitigating efforts from the government, and there has to be an involvement in terms of financial and social resources from the government, and it has to happen in collaboration with the people that are affected. So one thing that we really learned is that it has to be communication from both sides. So everybody can contribute and find a good solution in place in the specific area, what might be most useful, and use especially the knowledge of the local people who live there, and maybe traditional knowledge they also have that worked for hundreds of years, maybe, to incorporate that in adapting to the places, because they find ways. That's what we found. They find ways to stay where they are as long as they can. And from our research, the best way to go through it is go through community leaders as key actors in between, to educate them, to help them help their communities to adapt to rising hazards and long-term climate change.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for the explanation. So the cooperation and coordinations between the governments and the people or the community in small islands are very, very effective to mitigating the, let's see, for the sea level rise or the climate change. So I'll just, to the students, untuk kalian ada pertanyaan? Do you have questions? No questions at all?
Maybe as long as you think of questions, I mean, it would be very nice to get questions from your side, because these questions are always also helping us to develop our research further. Maybe to add to Konstantin, I totally agree with that. And this basically that's our message, to look more for bottom-up strategies, for social adaptation measures. But my observation is from, say, workshops, for example, on Java with NGOs and with government officials, that this story is not easy to tell them. And with the government, I have to be careful now, because I'm talking about Indonesian politics, so it's not my field. So But my impression is that a lot of people in government, in politics, have a tendency to trust technical solutions here. So there's always kind of a preference for technical solutions. It's not that I say that technical solutions are not a solution. Of course, a dike and embankment can help, no doubt about it. But here it seems to me that very often they first look to technical and don't actually look at these other ways to accommodate to these changes. This is my impression. So it's a bit like a technical fix barrier or something. That's also present in Europe. I mean, it's not an Indonesian thing, but it is very often with government officials because building something in concrete is visible and it's a political success. And if you do these small community projects, not that's visible in a policy context. And the second lesson I learned talking to NGOs, there's another problem if you talk to NGOs, because you see this example of Semarang actually shows that you have this flooding problem in Semarang, no doubt about that. And you have this regional sea level rise, no doubt about it. But the major reason for that is not climate change. It's local problem. Having this heavy building loads on the ground through urbanization buildings or taking groundwater. Groundwater inspection is actually the cause why this flood increases. It's not the climate change signal. And this is very hard to digest from an NGO perspective because NGOs working in the Nepa and many other parts of the world raise money in America, in Western Europe, in Japan, or elsewhere in the world because they tell the story of climate change making the world inhabitable. And then if you tell a story, yes, that's true, but the major cause here might be a local reason, it's not something that actually helps NGOs to raise money. And therefore, it's also a very difficult story to tell. Yes, I totally agree with what Konstantin said, but it's a message that it's very hard to get across to politicians as well as to NGOs. So that's our experience.
Thank you very much for the explanation. So, yeah, in Bali, Indonesia in general, we also have kind of a difficulties to cooperate together with the NGOs and, for example, us in your university also have a minimum role in the government decision. So that needs to be intensified. Um, I believe we still have 6 minutes, so I'll just deliver a brief conclusion. So, as a coastal hazard and adaptation, which different country has a different style of adaptations to the coastal hazard and climate change, where people tend in some country people tend to retreat and some people tend to stay on their houses, and also let's see, in Bangladesh, mostly like to temporary migrate from the house to get more like economic factors and so also family factor. That adaptations is important because adaptation to climate change is what make us um, to be more sustainable in the future. So thank you very much to our speaker, Professor Bruce Brown and Konstantin Gizevius from Department of Geography, University of Cologne, Germany. Thank you very much for your nice presentation, and it brings lots of knowledge to us. And before closing, we would like to give you appreciation, a certificate of appreciation for your like a share of knowledge. Please, we can probably uh, go to front. Then we can get take photos together. Is that okay? Of our appreciations to both of you. Thank you very much for coming to our university, Professor Brown. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's all I can give. And to yes, and to Konstantin. please. Thank you very much for your presentation and coming to our university. On behalf of the Faculty of Agriculture, Udayana University, Bali, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation and your coming to Bali, Indonesia. We hopefully you have a pleasant stay and you can finish your research in a very good result. And sekarang probably we're gonna take photos. How oh dari atas ya. Oke, siapa yang mau foto? Pak Yun bisa ngambil foto dari depan, Pak Yun? Iya. Kamu dah yang paling belakang tuh. Siapa namanya? Sini, sini. Sini. Ini kamu foto selfie sendiri ya? Take photos together with all the participants. So, satu, dua, tiga. Oh, satu, dua. Let's say cheese, okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. Thank you very much, Professor Brown and Constantine. You can sit back. So we are ending today's seminar. It's already 3 p.m. local time in Bali. So we thank you very much for all the participants, faculty leaders, professors, lecturers, students, for all your participations here. Hopefully we can meet you again. Kita ketemu lagi minggu depan untuk mata kuliah ya. Actually, I'll see them in next week for GIS class. So saya tutup dengan Pak Santi. Om Santi. Om. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Shalom. Rayu semua ya.
Santi Om.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu yang hadir secara online. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih. Materinya tolong di-share nih.
Ya, baik. Silakan Bapak Ibu mengisi absensi yang sudah ada di kolom chat ya. Untuk teman-teman di kelas silakan mengisi absensi. Nanti sertifikat akan kalian dapatkan juga dikirim langsung ke email. Pastikan penulisan nama dan emailnya benar ya.
Terima kasih Pak Tung.
Terima
kasih.
Karena kita bersama 2 jam, kalian pasti lapar, silakan ambil konsumsi depan ya. Satu ya, ambil ya masing-masing ya. Thank you. Acara bebas ya. Boleh makan tapi jangan di sini kotor nanti. Di luar ya. Disir. Kalau perlu sertifikat, absen ya. If you choose minggu depan aja dah ya kalian. Kalau perlu sertifikat yang lain bisa diusahakan.
Iya mas, aku bilang juga terkait sekarang juga.
Iya, kamu kayak menjat jadinya. Kamu masih tau kayak menjat. Kan? Ini harus kayak mana nada bicara. Aku begitu. Dia kayak bilang, galak itu sakit ya. Kalau bilang itu sebuah hal yang salah. Sakit benar atau salah? Sakit benar atau salah? Itu tidak benar, tidak salah. Itu tidak bisa diprediksi. Dan jangan kita nggak bisa. Hanya kita mewajarkan. Ada babi. Aku pengen padahal. Aku pengen. Nggak bisa nanti sore. Apa? Bodoh amat. Itu kau tidak tahu sendiri. 500 namanya itu.
Ayo kak,
Nanti sore. Tapi nggak apa-apa kita ada. Itu dia. Pengumuman
Aku aja tujuannya apa ya? Sebenarnya aku tuh tahu ini udah men-DP juga. Aku mau ganti toko.
ya bisa lah Pepeng. Sure.
Kau bantuin.
Burung di udara dipelihara.